what I'm going to do, with your permission, is have some general comments about the context, the contemporary context in Afghanistan, and some reflections on the past. Some of them might sound questioning. I don't apologize for that, because I think the more debate we have, the better, particularly amongst the cultural community. And then I'm just going to use a couple of examples of recent and previous sort of pre-2001 projects, not so much to fly a flag of our organization, although one of the projects is implemented by us, but also to raise questions about where do we go from here and how do we reflect on what we're doing and what we should be doing. The political and security context in which cultural activities operate in Afghanistan has changed dramatically in recent months, which of course we all know. As we find ways to adjust to the new circumstances and assess what challenges may face us in continuing conservation work, there is an opportunity to reflect on recent experience and take time to examine the achievements and the mistakes, yes, mistakes, in the sector over the past 2 decades. Drawing on the experience gained through conservation initiatives during this period, I'd like to take the opportunity to offer ideas for an approach that is more responsive, is based on rigorous analysis, takes account of the messy reality on the ground, which often is ignored, while ensuring positive and tangible outcomes for the ordinary citizens who are, as our experience demonstrates, the ultimate custodians of their heritage. And this theme about community involvement will run right through this, because I feel very strongly about this. The process of soul searching continues in military and political circles abroad about the dramatic collapse of Project Afghanistan. And it seems timely, therefore, for cultural practitioners and their donors to also assess their performance over the past 2 decades. For despite the self-serving rhetoric, aspects of the international cultural engagement in recent years have been counterproductive and even in some cases quite divisive. Until very recently, Afghan officials presented an image of a society struggling for cultural survival in the face of dark forces, to use their words, beyond its control. This was clearly persuasive, with international donors taking up the refrain of existential threats to justify their funding for the sector, often based on limited analysis. This support tended, however, to be conditional on aligning cultural objectives with those of the then dominant parties to the conflict, including this man here, the regime in Kabul then, and its military allies, which to my mind compromised in some cases any sense of neutrality in the eyes of ordinary Afghans. I was horrified only last week to read an ex-British official claiming in a reputable newspaper that, I quote, "Artists and cultural workers have been at the forefront of the battle," yes, the battle, he used that word, "for social advancement in Afghanistan as much as the people who assisted British forces and the government." Quite scary, those words. And we wonder why we lost. By acceding to or even promoting this type of alignment to military or political agendas, practitioners risk deepening the cultural fault lines they claim to be trying to bridge by buying into a dogma of us who are enlightened and them who are intolerant, and thereby possibly putting heritage and personnel at greater risk. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it's been very palpable in the field in the last 2 decades. As we all explore the space for work in the new circumstances, it seems important, therefore, to avoid such divisive approaches or to call them out and focus on what can be done to bring the diverse communities of Afghanistan together. These are children in the Wakhan corridor. Through Afghan history, however, culture has been a site of contest. It hasn't always been uniting, as successive regimes either ignored or erased physical traces of their forebears and built on the ruins to celebrate their own perceived achievements. There's nothing new about this. In modern times, culture has continued to be an instrument of ideology. This is a photograph of Soraya and Aminullah Khan, who were some of the first modernists and some of the most famous kind of harbingers for change in the country, who met a difficult fate. Those are the royalists, followed by leftist revolutionaries. This is a demonstration in Timur Shah Mausoleum in the 1970s. Different incarnations of Islamists, Mujahideen, latterly Taliban, or latter-day progressives. I didn't want to use anybody's photograph here. This is just graffiti in the Tajbek Palace in Kabul recently. All of these groups have strived to fashion culture in their image of national identity, a process that's playing out again today, as Afghans who strive to be modern are challenged by conservative groups who resist ideas and behavior that they perceive to be alien. And I would argue that whether we agree with that or not, that is actually the reality on the ground. Reconciling these different visions arguably poses as significant a challenge to those of us working on the ground as issues of international legitimacy and the protection of basic rights. One doesn't want to sideline those, but the finding common ground is an absolutely critical thing to making sure that projects can continue. The foundations of the political order in Afghanistan after 2001 were laid on a notion of forgetting, to use the words of Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Special Envoy at the time. And the notion was that forgetting can contribute to peace. And this guided the political transition that the international community oversaw in subsequent years. This is debris or material from the previous war in the Bamiyan Valley. Many of you will recognize it. Recent developments, however, suggest that this forgetting was something of a delusion, as aspects of the past deemed to be too difficult at the time in 2001 have come back to haunt Afghans and their erstwhile allies. Witness events of the last few months. In the realm of culture, this goes well beyond simply forgetting, as a narrative of loss has over the past 2 decades portrayed a notion zakhmi or wounded. To borrow David Reef's phrase, which was used in the context of the Balkans, this has risked transforming the sector transforming the wound that people feel into a weapon. And that, I think, those words could easily apply to Afghanistan. That phrase could easily apply to Afghanistan in the past few years. One example of this wound becoming a weapon is the extraordinary revisionism regarding the National Museum of Afghanistan, a very important site. Located close to the front lines between Mujahideen factions who fought each other after liberating Kabul in 1992, the museum premises was repeatedly rocketed and caught fire. These are photographs I took at the time of the storerooms during the course of the looting, which was carried out because we saw them and we photographed and we witnessed the whole thing, factional fighters. Physical measures to deter this looting proved to be in vain, as did repeated démarches to the factional commanders, who shall remain nameless for the present purposes. Despite photographic evidence of the looting of many priceless objects, the responsibility of the factions, whose leaders were until very recently senior politicians in Kabul, was deftly glossed over. Instead, the false narrative that I quote, our collection was destroyed by the Taliban was promulgated by both officials and repeated by donors to the museum, whose website to this day refers to, I quote, a dark era that caused the collection to be looted and destroyed, as if somehow this was just an inevitable result of conflict. I would say, how on earth can we expect future generations of Afghans to understand their history if the international institutions are complicit in denying the facts? That might sound strong, but I think it's very important that we call a spade a spade. I now turn to a recent conservation initiative, some of you will recognize this, that risked also being compromised by a similar process of distortion and even apparent manufacture of threats. This is the Buddhist stupa at Topderra in Parwan province, just to the west of Charikar, the provincial capital of Parwan. I'm sure the Afghans who are linked in will recognize it, where I have worked with Afghan colleagues between 2016 and 2020 with financial support from the US State Department on the stabilization and conservation. It's one of a string of Buddhist religious complexes along a key pilgrimage route that ran between the Indian lowlands, now Pakistan, and to the east, and Bamiyan to the Central Highlands to the northwest. It was probably built in the 4th or 5th century Common Era in a narrow valley, as you can see by the previous slide, above the Shamali plain. These are known as the Parman Mountains. Unlike many other sites of the period, the stupa at Topderra was relatively intact, although very little of the sculpture that would have adorned it has survived. It was opened, using his term, in 1833 by a British adventurer, Charles Masson, with an insatiable urge to collect relics, who described the stupa, I quote, as perhaps the most complete and most beautiful monument of the kind in these countries. I think I'm right in saying it's certainly the largest extant stupa in Afghanistan and possibly in the region. It's huge, and you'll see the scale. Despite damage to the drum by those working for Masson, and you can see the aperture on the bottom right where they opened it and dug in, they didn't find the reliquary, fortunately. The abundance of stone in the vicinity seems to have limited subsequent plundering of the site for construction materials, as is often the case in other sites, where for perfectly pragmatic reasons, villagers have retrieved stones and thereby destroyed a monument because they needed them. The intervention aimed not only to restore the surviving fabric of the stupa, whose dome rises about 30 meters above the ground level, but also to establish the extent and layout of a wider religious complex of which it was part. Excavation around the stupa drum, where you can see ongoing here in this slide, revealed significant sections of the original stone masonry made up of very small pieces of schist quarried from the hillside, so flat pieces of schist, which you can see here. Here's a detail of one of the lower platform. And it has been fashioned into a distinctive diaper masonry technique of that period, with architectural details that borrow almost exactly from the classical orders of Greek temples. Some of the details weren't extant, so we didn't rebuild them, but it can tell from other stupas. The raw stone masonry is pleasing to the modern eye, but would originally have been plastered and in all likelihood painted or gilded in order to attract passing pilgrims. This is the arcade around the drum, partially reconstructed, partially original after the completion of the project. During the course of the excavation, evidence emerged of a damaging flash flood after the construction, but not of deliberate man-made destruction since Masson's interventions in the 19th century. So we can't really blame any damage on this building, which is limited damage, on man-made activity since the 19th century, which is significant. In order to stabilize the structure, it was resolved after a phased process of excavation to reconstruct the stupa platform, reusing the material found in the rubble while ensuring that areas of new masonry can be distinguished from the original. Here you can see on the left the ongoing excavation of the rubble, and then in the middle, the platform, the fragments, sections of the platform emerging, and then in the foreground, in the corner, the selective, judicious reconstruction of what we found, sort of completion of what we found. We didn't put back anything that we didn't find in terms of details. Where we found an element, we replicated it. The reconstruction of the dome alone entailed lifting by hand of some 40 tons of stone from the ground, quarried from the mountains nearby. And here you can see how labor intensive that was, because we couldn't get a crane anywhere near the structure. And here is a later photograph showing the reconstruction of the stairs, the traces of the stairs to the east side facing the valley. You can compare this with an earlier photograph with elements that have been, particularly the ring around the base of the dome that has been stabilized. As is the case with our previous projects, there was a continuity of craft skills among the Afghans involved. Through a process of trial and error, masons were able to very effectively match the original stonework at Topderra. This is one of the niches that's being, in fact, reconstructed here, matching others that we found intact, which we replicated. As one of the foremen who was involved explained, if our Buddhist ancestors could achieve the standard of work, so can we. A reminder that gloomy assertions about a total loss of craft skills in Afghanistan, usually used to justify projects to rescue craft skills, are at times misplaced. What tends to be required in our experience, which is limited to building construction, are the right materials, the right tools, and a lot of patience and resources to pay for quality work. And usually people come out of the woodwork and either revive their skills or develop skills of a younger generation. The final stage of the intervention entailed excavation in the area to the west of the stupa, where there seems to have been a monastery or a residential complex with a series of overlaid enclosures you can see here, whose relation is still to be determined in detail. The excavation is not complete. And elements within that of obviously stucco, the bases, the traces of stucco sculpture, figurative sculpture, in this case just feet, and a lotus base of presumably a figurative statue. Not much else apart from that level up yet. So hopefully more will be found. Very little actual carved sculpture was found. This is one trace that was found elsewhere, which possibly was affixed somewhere to the drum or to the base of the, or in the monastery. We're not quite clear. All these objects are with the Archaeological Institute of Afghanistan in Kabul. And from this and a couple of other traces that were found, it was clear that this was a very well endowed site. This work is quite extraordinary. During the course of the works, we tried to explore what the stupa means for the villagers of Topderra. Here, the man who owned the land next to the stupa sowing his wheat a couple of springs ago. The villagers made up the bulk of the workforce that we used. Clearly, the stupa has no religious significance for today's Muslims, but it seems instead to have almost been assimilated into a mental map of the landscape that the villagers know intimately. There is little doubt that it's a source of local pride. Aware that the conservation work on a remote site would draw attention, we adopted a very low-profile approach, relying on villagers to handle casual visitors who may show interest, and they did, in a US-funded project in such a remote site, which was at the time not far from areas outside government control. Despite our light touch by the project team, once the conservation was sufficiently advanced to get their attention, government officials from Kabul held a succession of ceremonies with banners, flags, TV crews, and loudspeakers blasting the national anthem around the valley, which is totally their prerogative, but was unfortunate, while heavily armed security personnel fanned out across the site, as is often the case. The official line was that such events aimed to promote an inclusive cultural policy, to use their words, with some going as far as to claim that our work at Topderra was a response to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. Fortunately, there were no immediate consequences as a result of this bombast. I relate this to illustrate how, dare I say it, ill-informed attitudes and behavior, or clumsy behavior, have the potential to pose as much of a threat to work in the field as any crazed fundamentalist. As can grandstanding, I've been repeatedly asked in recent weeks by foreign journalists whether the Buddhist sites we're working on are under imminent threat as a consequence of political changes in Kabul. The implication being that investment in conservation of pre-Islamic sites might be intrinsically risky. There are, of course, many challenges. One doesn't want to play them down. But the fact that these structures have survived for the better part of 1,500 years seems unconvincing to those intent on pursuing a very partisan line and jumping ahead of the game. Perhaps my guarded optimism about these sites is naive. I'm happy to acknowledge that. But I would argue that the continued low-profile work of this sort, and many others doing it, is especially important now, even though we face a myriad of operational challenges. For this reason, I shall briefly describe ongoing conservation at Shewaki, funded by the Aleph Foundation. Very similar site. The structure is believed to be roughly contemporary with Topderra, and our technical strategy is similar, with the focus initially on the dome, you can see here, around which scaffolding was erected without risk of damage to the fabric below, which remained unexcavated in the early stages. The primary damage to the dome was again the result of an opening, this time by a German adventurer in the 19th century, who made a series of destructive attempts to locate the reliquary, which in the end was successful, that lay at the heart of the structure. Traces of this reliquary were found. Here you can see it. It's about 3 meters across, very finely dressed stone, and no sign of the reliquary or anything else, or even any traces that have been totally cleaned out. This has been reconstructed and then built back into the dome. Work then began on backfilling the dome, which entailed lifting again of something like 300 cubic meters of stone masonry laid in lime mortar to make it more durable. The original was mud mortar, which was extremely effective, but was beginning to erode quite fast. The dome had suffered a number of impacts from artillery rounds, presumably during fighting in the 1990s, and you might be able to see some of those there in the sort of top mid left. Those were repaired. Unusually for a structure of this age, areas of the original lime plaster on the dome, you can see a patch here on the left, that would have covered the entire structure had survived, and these were carefully stabilized with matching material. Here you can also see how the reconstructed sections of the dome, of the stone masonry, visibly project from the original fabric, so you can distinguish between before and after. Again, a very fine arcade, 56 identical niches around the drum, which has a diameter of about 15 meters. 13 of the damaged or missing niches were conserved or reconstructed. You can see that work underway here, along with the string courses below and above. With completion of the work on the dome, it was possible to embark on excavating the surrounding mound. You can see the work here. This is the northeast corner. The exposed sections, seen here, similar to what you saw in Topderra, were documented prior to stabilization and a judicious reconstruction of the missing parts using retrieved stone material in a manner that distinguishes it, as I described before. The upper platform, this is the upper platform, extends about 2.3 meters from the base of the drum, with a lower platform just over 3 meters below that. The precise dimensions of the lower platform will be determined by ongoing excavation. Both these platforms were used to circumambulate the dome at the level here, to go back to the slide. So there's probably a difference. Many of you will know more about this than I, and I need to do more research on it as to who circumambulated at a higher level or lower level, and if there was a difference in terms of the consequences of the people involved. During the course of the work on the platform, a number of unusual details emerged, including these carved stone capitals, which to me look like ram's horns or kind of caricatures of Corinthian capitals. Unusual in terms of being carved, because there isn't a lot of carved stone in the elsewhere. And they possibly were reused from another structure, which is not uncommon. Also, during the course of the excavation, we are yet to determine the precise configuration of the ceremonial stair to the north of the platform, but the traces have emerged of this quite strange sloping string course on one of the walls that flanks the staircase. It's very unusual to see something on an incline like this, to my mind, a detail that we've not seen elsewhere yet. Excavations to the north of the stupa platform revealed an extensive sacred area that is bounded by stone retaining walls and buttresses, with traces of a stair aligned with the main axis. Here you can see it from a drone shot. So this is looking from more or less due north. You can see this, the restored dome, the north stair, which is partially excavated, the work on the platforms, and then surprisingly, this almost fortified buttressed platform, which extends 20 so meters in front of the staircase and has a projecting element in its middle, which possibly contains a staircase. And these buttresses go round to the west as well, to the right of the slide. This is the way I think this was taken in June, this drone shot. Several secondary stupas have been exposed in this area, along with remains of clay kilns or furnaces with quantities of slag or ash, suggesting artisanal smelting of copper or iron that may have generated the resources for the construction of the complex. And interesting parallels there, obviously on a much larger scale, with Messainak, which seems to have been a major industrial site, as well as a religious and political site. Exploratory trenches dug to the east of the main stupa revealed traces of a larger complex comprising a number of other structures whose function remains unclear. Again, these buttress-type structures, and very much overlaid. They were obviously being built over a period of time. These include a series of superimposed stone masonry walls, along with a secondary stupa that unusually is surrounded by a perimeter wall with articulation on its inner face, forming an almost semi-subterranean ambulatory around a central structure. And the first thing that comes to mind looking at this is another site we've worked on, Topderra, which is obviously a natural carved out of the rock, but a very similar configuration with an almost underground ambulatory. These structures have been documented prior to backfilling, because this was very delicate and it was some way from the site. I trust that this brief overview of conservation work in progress illustrates what's possible even in the challenging circumstances that now prevail. Rather than deterring us, recent developments bring home how important such work might be for future generations of Afghans. It will only be possible if we remain responsive to the priorities of the host communities who, in the past as now, are the most effective custodians, as I've said before. It'll also require an honest reckoning as to the consequences, positive or otherwise, of the past 20 years of international engagement to ensure that culture is no longer used as a weapon. Thank you very much.